Good evening, everyone. The Late Night Mega here, and tonight we're playing a blue-white hardlock combo. This was a deck that I saw online. It was a budgety deck, and the idea was to play. Well, first you want to play this Curse of Exhaustion, which says your enchanted player cannot cast more than one spell each turn. And then you combine that with Knowledge Pool, which you play later, and it says when it enters the battlefield, each player exiles the top 3 cards. And basically what happens, anytime either player casts a spell, that spell gets exiled by Knowledge Pool. It does not resolve. And then that player can cast a different spell that's been exiled by Knowledge Pool. However, if you have this curse out, your opponent cannot cast that second spell, so they try to cast a spell, their first and only spell per turn. It gets exiled by Knowledge Pool, and they're not allowed to cast another card from Knowledge Pool because Knowledge Pool says you'd be casting that card from Knowledge Pool. So, in other words, with both these cards out, your opponent does not get to cast spells. And so that got me all kinds of excited. This is the closest thing to a combo deck you're probably going to see me play. And so I'm like, okay, that forms a really nice hard lock. And we also have a rule of law in here, so it affects each player as well. So if you have the rule of law out, things get a little bit more tricky, but you do want something else besides just the curse, just in case like some surgical extraction or slaughter games type of thing happens. Another thing that's good to have if neither player can cast spells is Elspeth Sun's Champion. You can still use activated abilities of stuff. You can use activated abilities of lands too. We'll get into that. So yeah, that's pretty good to have out when your opponent can't cast spells. And that's one of the very few ways to actually win the game. Well, let's talk about the lands. So you can still activate man lands, so Celestial Colonnades. Of course, since I own Colonnades and Flooded Strands and Hallowed Fountains and stuff, I opted for the non-budget version of this deck because we already had that. In fact, the only cards I didn't own for this deck were the Curses, Rule of Law, Knowledge Pool, and maybe this Elixir of Immortality up here. And yeah, other than that, I own the whole deck, so I'm like, well, why not? I can pick up these few remaining cards at my local game store for like $5 total, and I get to try out this really interesting deck. So you can still activate manlands and stuff, and that's why we run 4 Ghost Quarters and a Tectonic Edge. Temple of Enlightenment here to help us scry and get to our combo a bit faster. Other things about this deck, we have a ton of 2-mana counter spells. You've got 2 Condescend, 4 Mana Leak, and 4 Remand. They all turn on by turn 2, and so that's kind of interesting. It's kind of a two-edged sword. I like having that many counter spells, cheap counters, but at the same sense, it can be a disadvantage when your opponent is playing stuff that doesn't really care about counters, where they're able to play stuff before you get your counter mana up, and that can turn out to be really bad. But then we have we've got typical paths and supreme verdicts there for board control. We also have Azorius Signets and 3 Mind Stones. It is recommended that you play at least 5 of these mana-making artifacts. I opted for 3 on the Mind Stones because once you no longer need them, you can sacrifice them to draw a card. But yeah, just some mixture. It could be 4 and 1, it could be more Signets, whatever you prefer. And then we also have Thirst for Knowledge here, which is another piece of the deck that I really liked. Since we're running all these artifacts, we can run Thirst for Knowledge to dig a lot deeper into our deck, discard an extra Knowledge Pool because you're bound to get an extra one. You don't need more than one. Or discard an extra Mind Stone or Signet. So yeah, really neat that we get to play some powerful instant speed card draw like that. That was another reason I was excited about this deck. Sideboard has mostly some standard stuff you guys have seen from me. 2 Relic of Progenitus, 3 Surgical Extraction, Disenchants, Detention Spheres, Answer Stuff, Answers to Burn with Pulse of the Fields and Timely Reinforcements. Gideon as another alternate finisher. I would bring this in anytime that, 2/2 Knights would be good to have. It'd be good against burn decks. We've got ley lines in here as well to protect us from discard, because targeted discard just rips this deck apart. And or anything that could potentially handle an Elspeth. You might want a secondary Planeswalker. So I opted for Gideon. Wasn't disappointed by him. I've only played this deck like one night, one local Tuesday night, I believe it was, at my local game store, and I don't feel like this deck was something that I wanted to continue playing. It felt very one-dimensional, I'll say that. It basically works to put up this combo, this hard lock combo, and that's about all it does. It doesn't do too much. A couple other things interesting. Curse of Exhaustion is really an interesting card as well. I might want to explore this further. Once you combine this with a Remand, basically it shuts down your opponent's entire turn. Curse says they can only cast 1 spell per turn. You remand it, even if they have the mana to recast it, guess what? They can't, because they already tried casting a card. So I like that sort of interaction as well. Also, the curses do pretty well shutting down storm decks or combo decks in general, and so that's really interesting. Things this deck is weak against, pretty much everything from what I saw. Anything that can get rid of your enchantment, that's going to be a problem. Of course, even if you have your hard lock out, if you're playing against Tron and they cast an Ulamog, the Ulamog will get exiled under Knowledge Pool. However, they will get the cast trigger off of the Ulamog. It does not stop the cast trigger, so they will get to exile both halves of your combo if they want. So that's not good. Anything that can get rid of the curse before you get the Knowledge Pool in play is a problem for this deck. Now, people would say that, the problem is you're playing a 6-mana card as a sorcery, and that's the problem with this deck. It is and it isn't. Keep in mind, I've played Cruel Ultimatum, a 7-mana sorcery, to great success. Cruel Ultimatum is one of my trifecta of best decks that you've heard me talk about throughout this series. And so I didn't mind tapping 6 mana for a Knowledge Pool. But where the problem with this deck comes into play is it's not just tapping 6 mana on one turn, it's tapping 4 mana on one turn, and then on a later turn tapping 6 mana. So trying to do both of those things is where the challenge of this deck comes into play. Because once you tap out for Curse, your opponent's going to play stuff. You might need to play a Verdict before you play the Knowledge Pool. Of course, once again, you're tapping a bunch of mana on your own turn, and that's where you're going to get into trouble with this deck and this combo. Also, if you opt to play Elspeth before Knowledge Pool, well, now you're talking about tapping a bunch of mana on 3 turns. They don't have to be turns in a row, but it's really challenging to try and do that, even with this all these mana accelerants up here. So, and that's where the main downfall of this deck came from, and that's kind of why I don't want to pick it up again, at least not anytime soon. I mean, it might be fun to pull out every once in a while just to play, have an interesting time. The look on your opponent's face when you pull off this Curse and Knowledge Pool combo, and if they don't quite realize the interaction yet, and then they try to cast a spell, and then you're like, oh, it gets exiled under Knowledge Pool. And they're like, okay, well, now I get to play something under Knowledge Pool. No, you don't, because you can only cast 1 spell per turn, and you already tried casting your 1 spell. So that's a funny interaction. But other than that, this deck doesn't do a whole lot. It doesn't interact well with a bunch of different decks, like anything that plays 1-mana threats like Infect and stuff that can get under your counter spells. When these counter spells are bad, you don't really have ways to side them all out. That's kind of just the way it is. That's another thing I didn't like about the decks. Like I said, it was a two-edged sword. But overall, it was fun to try. And like I've said before on this channel, not every deck is going to be a home run. Some of them are going to be successes, some of them are going to be failures, and some of them are going to have like average performance, one-night stands, if you will, like this deck. But it was fun. I'm glad I tried it. This is another deck in my arsenal. And maybe I can revisit this whole lockdown combo. I saw another lockdown deck that was quite interesting looking recently. It had like several different lockdown combos, and yeah, so I might look into that. But that's pretty much all for this deck. So right now on our timeline, we are at we are just approaching Oath of the Gatewatch being released. In fact, the next deck will be a post Oath of the Gatewatch deck. And so Oath was coming out, or Oath had just come out, and I'm like, okay, there's all this colorless stuff, and we have Tron decks that have been forever plaguing me. So my next deck, I have, you've seen an anti-burn deck on this channel. The next deck will be a dedicated anti-Tron deck. And so that's going to be all kinds of interesting. So prepare for main deck crumble to dusts next time. And I'll see you all then. Good night, everyone.